Hi everyone, Steve and Pauline Richards have built their model of depth psychology, psychosystems analysis, first and foremost through clinical empiricism, over the last 42 years. Since that time, however, many new insights from the biosciences have emerged, which support the original findings from Steve and Pauline, such as Professor Jaak Panksepp's Affective Neuroscience and Professor Mark Solms's neuropsychoanalysis. However, psychosystems analysis is unique in its emphasis on complexes, which, through decades of observation, have proven to be preeminent in the formation and maintenance of so-called neurosis. In this video, taken from a high-level second-year IPSA professional training seminar, I present some quotes from Professor Jaak Panksepp's Affective Neuroscience, which support Steve and Pauline's revisions to Carl Gustav Jung's original description of complexes. Steve uses these as a dialectic prompt to go into more detail than has ever been presented on the Jung To Live By channel before on the dynamics of the ego and complexes, drawing on Pierre Janet's pioneering work into dissociation and the neuropsychoanalytic concept of automatized memory to help illustrate his and Pauline's original model. The role of one's own personal identity and personal myth timeline are brought forward into their proper place. We really hope that you enjoy.
The work of Panksepp and Solms is confirming our observations independently, completely independently, particularly to do with emotion or affect as instinct. And those of you who've looked at it will know I made the observation that the Jungians and Jung himself took emotion to be a passive matrix that was held in common between ideas, as if the ideas and memories were important in and of themselves rather than the affect charge that they carried. So the way Jung described that is a common emotional tone, which can be interpreted in a number of different ways. But the way that it's been obvious to Paul and I for decades now is that the affect itself is active and it arranges the ideas to itself rather than ideas which would be otherwise disconnected kind of communicate and say, oh, we share a common emotional bond or tone, let's join together. It doesn't seem that it's that way at all. And that's on empirical grounds. And it seems that Panksepp himself said something like that. And Mark Solms is hinting at something like that. But what's missing for them is a Jungian style model of complexes and a Rossi style model of complexes that we've been familiar with, as I say, for several decades. And it's the stuff of our everyday work.
I've put a few quotes into the chat there. You guys can take a look at if you'd like to. They're just from the first part of Affective Neuroscience. And when I read those, the shadow in the background of the absence of complexes stood out really, really significantly. So if you read over those, I wonder if the same thing happens to you guys. If you're like, wait a minute, he's talking about complexes, but he doesn't quite know it. So I think it helps support the model further on that front.
Would you mind reading through them, James? Then at one at a time, let's see if we can get some.
Yeah, sure. So they're all taken within about a couple of pages of each other, but three distinct quotes. First one, the main thing that develops in emotional development is the linking of internal affective values to new life experiences.
Wow.
It just leaves that quote there, and that kind of stood out. It's like, yeah, that's complex theory, as described by yourself, Steve and Pauline.
Yeah, it is. It's so close. They just don't use the term complex, but other than that, the idea that's present there is bang on, isn't it?
Yeah. Next one is neurochemical systems develop and remold at both pre and post synaptic sites throughout the lifespan of organisms. So if you include or combine that quote and the previous one together, and you can do, given the context of how it's written, that gives evidence of the dynamic nature of complexes, and that they're not, or at least dynamic over a long term, specifically with this particular quote, and that they're not permanent at all. You know, across the lifespan, neurons are plastic in that sense. The last one is a little bit longer, but indeed, neurons in specific adult motivational systems can expand and shrink depending upon the environmental challenges and the resulting hormonal tides to which an animal is exposed. So the key part there being adult. It is becoming ever increasingly clear that there is a dynamic interaction between the environment and genetic events in the brain. You mentioned a little while ago, still this week, that Brett Weinstein said the same thing very recently. With such, I've lost it. With such complexities, it is a risky business to suppose that the stages of emotional and moral development that we see in human children are simply due to the specific life experiences they have acquired. At the same time, it is foolhardy to push the biological view too far. Even with identical genetic backgrounds, there's a great deal of epigenetic diversity in the fine details of the nervous system. Only the general ground plans for brain connectivities are encoded within the genes, and probably quite indirectly at that via expression of various trophic factors, etc. Neural growth is responsive to a large number of internal and external stochastic processes that leads to a diversity of detailed differences in every nook and cranny of the brain. But despite the infinite variety in the details, the overall plan of the mammalian brain has been highly conserved. So again, the key point there being, he says, don't be psychoreductionist, don't be bioreductionist, and the genome and the environment talk to each other, which again is exactly what you guys have been saying for decades. I thought they were just really cool.
Thank you. It was kind of you to fish all of that out. That's great. Yeah, Brett Weinstein was talking about how the genome basically does read the environment and responds through its expression. And that must be interactive, because if it's reading its environment, it's receiving information, and it won't just be through the senses. It'll have to do, and he didn't say this, but it must be the case, it will have to do with how learning is dealt with, not just through memory consolidation, say in a Mark Solms sense, where information comes in and then is passed through various stages, eventually into repression. It'll have to do with real-time changes with respect to the ego, and then what it attaches to its self-concept. That is to say, the repository of its self-reflexive identity. In other words, this is me, and that's not me. So what's in the self-concept is dynamic. And that I think is a very important thing. Jung, for example, if I can just mention this, Jung's definition of the ego is that it's, and I think it's a good one, but a bit limited. It's the center of the field of consciousness. It doesn't define that field except in the most nebulous terms, to say that the further something is away from that bright focal point, the more unconscious it is. That makes intuitive sense. But what his own work suggests, implies clearly, and that of Freud, through, for example, in Freud's case, the free association method, in Jung's case, word association tests and psychophysiology tests that he did, what that implies is that there is a specialized part of the ego, which is not the bright light and is not that far away. It occupies something in between, but is so important because that provides us with our sense of identity. Now, he didn't say that. He didn't say there is a special part of the ego. We call it the self-concept. That is the learned mirror that we have on the inside that is interacting. He didn't say it directly, but he demonstrated that it must exist when he uncovered complexes. You also don't get this with Mark Solms. Mark is very close to the original Freudian understanding of what the ego is. I think he's right as far as he goes. I think it makes perfect sense that the ego is limited because it's mainly processing information real time through the senses and some mental turning over, but it gets full quickly, and it's in the interest of the ego, therefore, to repress, in other words, to become unconscious. But it's where does that go? If it's simply a kind of linear change of progressive consolidation of memory without a dynamic factor, and he does suggest that there are dynamic factors, but he doesn't say what they are. Well, what is that dynamic factor? I'm suggesting, and we suggest very strongly, again on the basis of empiricism, that is the self-concept. And if you have a dynamic model of complexes, you have to take those which are very closely associated with the ego, to the extent that are identified with it, into account, in order to understand how the phenomenon of dissociation occurs, as identified by Jung's teacher Pierre Janet. When the ego itself splits, it's not perception that splits. It's not that one eye's looking at one thing and another's looking at another. That doesn't happen. What splits is the sense of who we are. Now that is the self-concept. That's our sense of identity. And where is that in relationship to Jung's bright light, which is the center of the field of consciousness? What is it? He doesn't describe it. Neither does Freud. But Pierre Janet implies directly that that's what happens. And Jung quotes Janet now and again, but doesn't put him into a proper context. Jung talks about partial personalities, not subpersonalities, not complete personalities. What he actually emphasizes them more as psyches, splinter psyches. So that's one step away again from personifying or reifying them. But he doesn't go into detail. He calls them complexes. And then he attaches complexes to names of significant relationships, the mother complex, the father complex, whatever. Either takes up one complex which he thinks runs the entire system, the inferiority superiority complex, the same thing basically. And Freud goes for the Oedipus complex, out from which he believed everything, including religion, has emerged. For Freud, religion was a product of the Oedipus complex, along with the superego, which was the monotheistic God. And Freud's very hard about that, very, very hard. I think he goes too far. But for his day, he was absolutely groundbreaking. The risks he took with saying things that were not politically correct. I hugely admire him. I think he's not properly evaluated in terms of his significance. But to return to our model, we then have complexes which are so implicit, they are identified with. And then we go to Psalms and say, yes, they're unconscious, but they're part of our self-reference identity. They're not automatized because we can access them. And it seems that they can access us. In other words, they focus Jung's bright light of consciousness. Because when they intrude, when we think about them, or we think about them because they've intruded, then our attention is on them even more than our sensory processing. We become unconscious of our sensory processes and conscious of a memory or an impression about us. So something which is not the usual definition of the ego is controlling that informational flow. And then we find that some of these ideas and impressions that appear in our mind respond as if they're independent splinter psyches. We can identify them on word association and free association tests. We can find them on the capnograph. We can find them in terms of symptoms. So they're the identified complexes. And then we see the resistance to letting go of them, because we think it's us. So we don't want to separate. They are split from us because they're autonomous. They're doing their own thing. But we don't let go of them because they are identified with. Then there are others, and they're the ones that we're aware of and we push away actively. We can say, that isn't me, it's unpleasant, I don't really want to know about this, I'll push them away. So we suppress them. We're not repressing them, they're not going into long-term consolidation of memory as Mark would think of it. They're still dynamic and they can move in, but we know it's not us, they're just a nuisance. They are the aligned complexes. And then there are others which we have to intuit exist because they must. And I say this because we cannot directly observe them unless we go through either an identified or an aligned complex to find them. And these are the non-aligned complexes, which are still dynamic, that are not automatized into memory, but they may form part of a system. So you may start with an identified complex, and in effect, if you stimulate that through word association, dream analysis, an enactment, a santre, wherever it might be, you stimulate that. And then you get one or more apparently autonomous aligned complexes start to be disturbed by the fact that you've prodded the identified one. So you go after them, and as you do, you find something emerges which is like, what the hell is that? Where did that come from? And this is the person's ego saying that. And then you find the really powerful one might be something which had been automatized to the extent that it was completely unconscious. But here's the rub. Mark would say you can't access fully automatized memories. So is it fully automatized, or is it hovering between being fully automatized? I think this is more likely. It's still dynamic, but is away from, completely away from consciousness. We have to find it. And then there's the peculiar nature of these complexes, that they seem to be capable of being generated internally without external reference. How the hell did that happen? It might be, in other words, around an experience we've not had but might anticipate, and not consciously but genomically. So the instinctive pressure from the genome to experience some lifespan development issue in life has been prepared for. It's going to be delivered, but the ego's not ready for it. But that information was on its way and didn't get there. So it sits there in this a non-aligned state, but it still attracts other things to it, because that will be its route. When the time is right, it will receive a bit more of an impetus in the form of a drive state, gene expression, affect, and then it will come and it'll burst out. What the hell, where did that come from? And then we can see it. We can see it for what it is. It's a deep structure complex that's been created in effect by the genome via instinct, because it itself then becomes, when we're conscious of it, a clear figure against the background of instinct. And when the ego receives that, it tends to interpret it by reference to the outside. And then we get what Jungians call an archetypal image. And then they go one further and say, there is an archetype, and that was the archetype, and that I've understood the archetype. Now, what's all that's happened is that your self-concept has intercepted this thing coming through, and instead of relating to it properly in the outside world, you've created a fantasy around it as a vessel to contain it and attempt to explain it away. That will involve further repression, or sorry, suppression or repression. And so the deep structure complex then is right down on that chain from the genome right the way up, and caps further expression of itself, because it will convert that into fantasy. The reason it will do this is not to stop the ego from experiencing it, but because the ego has said, this is how I want, or the only way I can experience this instinct is to create a fantasy image around it. See, this is how the dialectic works. Because it contains it, it can do that for a while, but some of that libidinous pressure, that free energy, will want to get out. It'll want to bypass or push harder, and then people start to feel things, unpleasant things, because the signal is not being received and it's not being interpreted. And then vague ideas about being depressed or not being engaged with life, or a lack of meaning, as Jungians talk about it. Because instinct always involves meaning. And it involves meaning because it involves the reward system, the seeking system, because we feel good when something means something and makes sense. But it only does that because of the affect is the true bridge between genome behavior by the ego in the environment, and it lines up, we feel good, and then we get this idea that this is a transpersonal, transcendent experience that we could call archetypal. And it is, but not without the context of biology, which has produced it, because biology and the environment are continuous anyway. So those things which can be classed as being spiritual are also biological. And when Jung talked about this, he called it spiritus insertus atomis, spirit in the most indivisible, smallest part of matter itself. And that was an intuition, I think, on his part, that everything is connected, which is why he said unus mundus, one world. They are connected. But an ego which is out of tune with the reality of biology and the spirituality of biology will tend to project biology and its deep structure meaning into a vessel which it will call spiritual and transpersonal. They typically call it transpersonal. And so the problem with that is it's inflationary, and it fills up the self-concept. When the self-concept fills up, it displaces other things. So you'll find a person whose self-concept is inflating, there's no room for other things. They lose their energy. They can't get close to the ego. There's no internal homeostasis going on. There's no correction for inflated ideas. There's only identification with them. but it's actually functionally maladaptive. So you know then that that person's inflating and they're using that energy. This is unconsciously. It's just the way the system is trying to sort itself out, use it to keep them in a state of balance, but they're not optimally adapted. Then when their belief system fails, the deflation will be proportional to the amount of inflation, as there's an inrush of libido back towards the genome in an attempt to correct for the maladaptation, and you get depression. So fundamentally, that's how those things can work with respect to the information which James has found, which is great. Thank you for that, James.
If you enjoyed this video and want to continue your study of psychosystems analysis, then check the description for links to further resources, including our Discord server, our suite of educational handbooks, and our application page for professional training under Steve and Pauline Richards, leading to accreditation as a hypnotherapist and psychotherapist. Thanks, and we'll see you in the next video.